you're a large critic of legal migration.
We had more immigration in the last 25 years than in the last 2,000 years combined. Only 1 in 20 immigrants to Britain is a high earner. The vast majority of migrants who've come to this country are a net drain on the economy from the moment they set foot on British soil. If they get to retirement age, each one will have cost the taxpayer £161,000. If they live to the age of 80, they will have cost £465,000 each. Yet all the time we're told, oh, the people coming over here are doctors and scientists and engineers.
Das, was die Menschen zu uns bringen, ist wertvoller als Gold.
Of the last 3.16 million visas granted, only 0.8% were doctors, only 0.6% were scientists and engineers. So it's been a wonderful act of deflection by successive governments to try to keep all the focus upon illegal immigration.
Remain here illegally.
Illegally.
All illegal migration.
Illegally. If you come illegally, you are an illegal migrant.
Whereas the real fundamental societal and demographic change has come via legal immigration.
My name is Stefan Tompson. I'm the founder of Visagrad24, and today I am in London with Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Rafe, great to have you.
Absolute pleasure.
You're a historian, a broadcaster, and recently you've become increasingly famous as you've done a massive tour of all the big British podcasts, saying some incredibly controversial things.
Well, they wouldn't have been controversial that long ago. That just goes to show you how far things have changed in society, that speaking common sense primarily is now treated as being beyond the pale.
One of the things that you discuss at length is the issues facing the United Kingdom. If you had to give me the 3 biggest challenges the United Kingdom faces today, what are they?
The 3 biggest issues are immigration, Islam, and the long march through the institutions, the left's capture, basically, of all our institutions. I often like to say that Britain is a post-revolutionary society, and it's sort of the thing that I say very frequently, because I want people to truly understand the state that we're in right now. The fact that we are actually the counter-revolutionaries now. That's why we're having to have these discussions, not on the mainstream media, but tucked away in podcast studios. We're almost like conspirators doing the fight back, despite the fact that we represent the views of the majority of the population. This has been a top-down revolution that's been foisted onto the British nation, and it's fundamentally changed every aspect of British public life. So every institution, the media, the press, the politics, cultural institutions, they've all been captured, HR departments in the corporate world, and the institutions look the same. But the people who inhabit those institutions bear no comparison to those people who originally built and ran them for years. They're cuckoos in the nest. And that's had a fundamental change on the way that the British state views its past, views its population, and views Britain's great heritage and legacy. And that's been innately destructive. And so, of course, we've had the rise of things, everything from white privilege to systemic racism, this idea essentially in everything almost to the point of open borders. And there has been, the ruling elite seem to have a revulsion for those things that used to define who it is to be British. And in a sense, what used to be known as love of nation has been turned into national self-loathing, and that has permeated all aspects of our society. And it's fundamentally dangerous because we now have the most radically left-wing youth in history. We've never seen the youth of Britain holding such radical views which are totally out of kilter with people who are even just 10 years older, let alone every other generation. And that brings, and of course, when you combine that with mass immigration and the importation of vast numbers of people who have no natural loyalty to Britain, who have no understanding of Britain's evolution, of the importance of our freedoms and our culture and our institutions, and of course people who are indeed culturally hostile to Britain and who view Britain as somehow inherently evil. That's a very toxic situation, which could lead to the point where in 20 or 30 years' time, the majority of the working age people of this country are not only ignorant of everything about Britain, but actually are hostile to it. In fact, if not loathe it.
One of the things you mentioned is the youth. I'm going to try and order this discussion, but I just wanted to bounce back on something you said about the youth. There's been a number of statistics that have been coming out in recent years, which have shown that Gen Z, we have an incredible disparity between the views of women and men, where men have broadly remained the same and women have been the radicalizing force in terms of becoming more left-wing. But one of the interesting things that with Gen Z is, from the studies that I have seen, there has been, for example, an uptick in religiosity amongst Gen Z. So they're more likely than millennials to be church-going, which I think is interesting, that you might have a large cohort of Gen Z being more radically to the left, but a swathe of it is much more radically to the right than previous generations. Is that something that you've seen?
That's true to a degree. However, I fear that too many people on the right are exaggerating the significance of that for a variety of reasons. Firstly, we've just got to the point now in terms of the national census where there are more people who identify as being atheist than identify as being Christian in this country. And there's no sign of that changing. And,
Wow.
And so atheism is extremely strong amongst the youth. And yes, there has been an uptick in church attendance, for example. It's still very much a minority interest. But also, I've not seen anyone actually explain the demographics behind who's going to church, because, of course, we've got a lot of people coming from Africa, evangelical Christians, people who aren't actually indigenous to the nation of Britain, and so people are also becoming. So we're seeing, alongside the rise of the radically left-wing youth amongst the indigenous population, we have this other group, which is the socially conservative youth who are Islamic or they're African, and that's why, for example, London is now the most homophobic city in Britain. It used to be for 100 years, if you were young and gay, you would go to London for a better life. Now, of course, it's just the reverse. No surprise, because London's only 37% white British, and you're not going to find high levels of homophilia, I suppose is the term, amongst religious Africans or religious Muslims, or indeed Eastern European Catholics to a great degree, who of course form the majority population in London. But there is, of course, a big gender divide too. But again, that mustn't be overplayed. Yes, men are much less likely, young men are much less likely to be woke. More young men voted for Nigel Farage's Reform Party than voted for the Conservative Party, for example. But we're still talking about single digits. If at the last election, and in fact the last two elections, the general election had been held only by those people under 30, there would have been the biggest Labour landslide in history, and there wouldn't have been a single Conservative member of Parliament elected. So it's on that level, and it's on that scale. And the rise of left-wing youth closely mirrors the rise of left-wing teaching. So when I was at school, it was a very good balance, probably a slight leaning to the right when I was at school in Canada and also here. Now in this country, 90% of teachers are left-wing. When I was at university, you would have 2 liberal professors for every 1 conservative professor. Now it's around 13 or 14 to 1. At Harvard, only 1% of professors who are in history are Republican voters. Now, I don't want a right-wing teaching profession or a left-wing. I want a balanced teaching profession. And it's no surprise, therefore, that children have become indoctrinated into left-wing groupthink. Aristotle famously said, "Give me a boy of 7 and I'll show you the man." Well, now it's give me a young man of 21 or a young woman who's 21, and they've been through essentially their entire lives being indoctrinated with specific viewpoints. And, of course, part of that involves this idea that we're born into original sin of racism. So if you ask the British youth of today, what is the number one issue facing Britain, you would expect them to say something, climate change or maybe Brexit. Racism. They think racism is the single biggest issue facing the British nation, despite the fact that Britain is the world's 3rd least racist nation, behind only Sweden and Brazil. Every year there's the World Values Survey, which is a very respected survey conducted by universities around the world, not known for being terribly right-wing, and they asked people around the world, how would you feel if somebody of a different race lived next door to you or married into you? And continually, Britain always ranks in the top 3 least racist. Most racist places, India, China, in Asia and elsewhere. The West, of course, is the least racist part of the country, but you would never know that if you opened any television channel or read any political speeches.
So let's go back to immigration. You're one of the rare voices in the public debate that doesn't just talk about illegal migration. You're a large critic of legal migration. Tell me more about that disparity between legal and illegal.
So my speciality is with the UK, but of course this applies so much to Western Europe more broadly. But illegal immigration is a drop in the ocean, but it's still a major issue. So, for example, Britain...
Because the narrative is dominated by illegals are arriving on little boats, they must be stopped. Illegal migrants are the problem, and the legal migration topic is broadly untouched in public discourse.
So it's been a wonderful act of deflection by successive governments to try to keep all the focus upon illegal immigration, whereas the real fundamental societal and demographic change has come via legal immigration. So illegal immigrant numbers are around 50,000 a year. Now, to put that in context, 50,000 a year was our total legal immigration in the 1990s. So we now have illegally...
Isn't that the number that Enoch Powell brings up in his Rivers of Blood speech of 50,000 migrants a year? And he says back in whenever it was, the 70s, late 70s, maybe early 80s, that was untenable then. Well, 50,000 a year.
I mean, some people may remember when Idi Amin kicked out the Ugandan Asians out of East Africa, and 28,000 or 24,000 came to Britain, and that was hugely controversial. And there were protests in the street, there was violence. The nation was hugely divided over whether we could accommodate that many people. We now get that in about every 6 weeks. Through legal immigration. To put it into context, last year we had 1.2 million gross immigration, legal immigration. We had more immigration last year than in the entire 20-year period from 1980 to 2000. We had that in last year. We had more immigration in the last 25 years than in the last 2,000 years combined. So no society can tolerate that. And once again, this is not an attack on immigration. This is an attack on mass immigration and the type of low-skilled immigration from culturally incompatible cultures that we've experienced in this country, which has fundamentally changed the nature of towns and cities. From the north of England to London, the towns and cities people grew up in no longer bear any comparison to the places that they once called home. And it's also important, another great act of deflection we see by political parties all the time is to talk about net figures, net immigration figures. So the net immigration figure is around, I think it's 700,000 or 800,000. Net, of course, is looking at the gross number who come, but then they subtract people who've left. So if 1 million come in and 500 million go out, that means you've got 500,000 net immigration. But the type of person who's leaving the country and the type of person who are coming are very different. White flight is in full effect. We see the brain drain is in full effect. Vast numbers of high-skilled Europeans are leaving the country. They're going to Canada, Australia, Spain, elsewhere. They're going back to the European Union, and we're importing into this country vast numbers of low-skilled, low-earning immigrants. To put this into context, we just had the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, was forced to come out with data showing that only 1 in 20 immigrants to Britain is a high earner. So 5% of immigrants are high earners. The vast majority of migrants who've come to this country are a net drain on the economy from the moment they set foot on British soil. If they get to retirement age, each one will have cost the taxpayer £161,000. If they live to the age of 80, they will have cost £465,000 each. Yet all the time we're told, the people coming over here are doctors and scientists and engineers. Only 0.8% of the last 3.16 million visas granted, only 0.8% were doctors, only 0.6% were scientists and engineers. It's a giant Ponzi scheme. It's suppressed wages. It's one of the reasons we have such a low productivity crisis in this country. Nobody, it seems apart from me, has linked productivity to the fact that we've imported such large numbers of low-skilled immigrants into this country, and it's creating a situation in effect where the low-skilled earners won't simply be able to fund any of the public services we were told. It's been one of the greatest scandals of our time, and too much of the attention again is placed upon illegal immigration, which of course is hugely important, but we're talking about the complete reshaping of an entire nation. And unfortunately, it's the reshaping of one of the nations that has created the modern world, and which still at this current moment is one of the world's most innovative nations. But when you have such dramatic replacement and a brain drain and a vast exodus of the types of people who did make Britain great, it calls into question how long Britain can remain a top-tier nation.
Why do you think there's such a pervasive lie about the people coming in? Why do you think that mainstream media is pushing this lie that these are... It's become a meme at this point, right? Doctors and engineers. I mean, there's a large subculture on the internet that will post videos of migrants committing crimes and saying, oh, the doctors and engineers are at it again. I mean, it's become a sort of joke in the culture. But the mainstream media and politicians, certainly the political elite, has been very serious about arguing we're bringing in people who will make our countries better. Why do you think that lie has been... Why do you think this narrative has been promoted?
Well, very simply because we are in a post-revolutionary society where we have a tiny elite who are beholden to the idea of open borders, who control all of the means of communication in this country, as I said. Now, we know full well why the left, Peter Hitchens, your viewers may be familiar with, who's now a very staunch conservative, but was a radical leftist.
Sure.
And he said, when he was a Trotskyist, he said that we were hugely in favor of open borders, not because we loved migrants, because we hated Britain and the West. And we must understand that those are the types of people who are now in power. There's a visceral sense of self-loathing, of nihilism. It's deeply destructive and it's demoralizing, but there's a sort of a perverse masochism to it almost, in inviting into this country people that you probably know are harming it, but it's somehow you are cleansing yourself, you are paying penance for the perceived sins of the British Empire, of slavery and racism. And this is now in a strange sense, it's also racist. It's almost like the white man's burden. We now have to take these people in and do what we can to look after them. But also, don't forget the politics here. Mass immigration started with Tony Blair, and the policy was very clear. We know this from Andrew Neither, who was the speechwriter to the immigration minister at the time. They wanted to flood Britain with mass migration because they knew that 80% of ethnic minorities vote for the Labour Party. And the idea was, over decades, you would import a new demographic that would ensure and guarantee that the Labour Party would have electoral majorities forevermore. And if you look at places like London, like Birmingham and elsewhere,
Sure.
It's clearly a policy has worked. Those are one-party Labour states. Of course, it's come back to bite them in the rear.
And this is what I was about to bring up. We've seen the return of sectarian politics to Britain with the rise of the Gaza independence. The 4 MPs elected on a purely Gaza electoral platform, Adnan Hussein being perhaps the most famous of them. And now we have this new party rising with Corbyn's strange alliance. And suddenly we're seeing that actually was Labour wrong? I mean, we are seeing the rise of political parties that will be Islamist political parties, fundamentally.
The lack of long-term thinking when they implemented such a fundamentally destructive strategy of importing vast numbers of people from the subcontinent clearly wasn't on their mind. Because, yes, we've got to the point now where they said, well, actually, we don't need to have the Labour Party represent us. We have reached critical mass in the north of England, in Burnley, in Bradford, in Birmingham, in Rotherham, in Rochdale. We can have our own representatives, and the Labour Party have known that. So the big story of everyone was speaking about at the last election was the election of 5 Reform MPs. The other story was the election of the Muslim vote, these MPs, who again, yes, they're not concerned about education, health, local issues. They were elected on a Gaza platform. And at that election, what we saw during the election campaign was the politics of Pakistan being imported into this country. We had mobs in the street intimidating candidates. We had an MP's office burnt to the ground.
Wow.
We've had assassination attempts. We had MPs, Labour MPs, cowering in their offices, scared to leave the parliamentary precinct, putting panic buttons into their homes and their constituency offices. And I'm sorry, but they brought it all upon themselves. And they are now so beholden to the Muslim vote. They are so petrified of losing the Muslim vote because, of course, many of these MPs, their majorities are only a few hundred votes. that they essentially are bending over backwards to accommodate the Muslim vote. So we saw, for example, deliberate attempts by the Labour Party to cover up the Pakistani grooming gangs, the rape gangs in the north of England, and they did a deal, utterly corrupt deal. They said, we will turn a blind eye to to what's happening in the north of England if you can get us postal votes. And local Muslim leaders would go door to door, often with Muslim gang leaders, and half the people there can't even speak the language, don't really know how to vote, and they would just be asked to sign the blank postal ballots, and vast tranches of these postal ballots were then deposited for the Labour Party. This is the rotten boroughs, the corrupt politics of the 19th century, alive and well in the north of England, brought in because of these. Again, this is the.
Can you tell the story of the
Pakistan.
rotten boroughs to viewers who might not be familiar with it? It's such an excellent story.
Well, the rotten boroughs were a period before in the early 19th century where there were many constituencies where essentially there were an MP had probably never even visited their constituency. There may have been a man and two chickens in that constituency. It was entirely corrupt, and it was essentially a way to get a seat in Parliament. And It was cleared up with the Great Reform Act of 1832, tidied up a lot of that. And yes, Britain is the country that created modern democracy as we know it. Yes, Greece created ancient democracy. There are only two systems of government in the world. There's parliamentary democracy and there's American-style presidential government. Both of them are of English origin. No country has done more to shape liberty, democracy, the rule of law, and to see it being undermined within. Also, of course, free speech. We are the land of liberty and free speech. The Americans have it entrenched in the First Amendment in the Constitution. But why is it there? It's because Americans wanted to have the American Revolution, as one of the founding fathers said. We want the rights of our true-born English brothers. They were Englishmen. These were the rights of Englishmen that they wanted to entrench. The irony is they have a written constitution, we don't, and so the freedoms and liberties we gave birth to in this country are now safeguarded in America in a way that they aren't over here.
Rafe, you're one of the very few people in the public arena that speaks of something that's quite taboo, and it's white demographic decline. It's a sort of almost naughty subject to even address it. I mean, there's almost a sense of one is entering a sort of dangerous space. Tell me about, the numbers that you've presented at the beginning of the interview are just horrific. I mean, to hear them listed out that way so methodically I was aware, obviously, of the scale of migration. I was born and raised in London. I grew up in this city, and it's certainly changed to the naked eye. You can walk around the city and you can see that it's just a different place to the place I grew up in. Tell me about white demographic decline and what that means.
So in 2010, Professor David Coleman, who is a Professor Emeritus of Demography at Oxford University, one of the world's leading demographers, he forecast that by 2066, the white British would be an ethnic minority within the UK. Now, that was based upon immigration figures that are half of what we're currently going through. So by my estimation, I would estimate that by the 2050s, the white British will be a minority within the United Kingdom, and that raises all sorts of questions because will Britain still be Britain if it's only 30% or 60% or 50% white British? At what point does Britain stop being British? These are fundamental questions, I think, which call into question the identity of the nation. And how can you expect people to integrate or assimilate into a country where the indigenous population is itself an ethnic minority? We shouldn't be afraid or ashamed to discuss these things. It's fundamentally important. If this was happening in Asia, in Africa, elsewhere, people would be raising the alarm about this. But of course, the only population...
Would people be talking perhaps even of genocide, saying that there's a willful destruction via immigration of an indigenous population?
Well, in London, I've often said, I'm a London born and bred, but the true Londoners, the Cockneys, there are if you find one of them around, they are an endangered species, and often you find them in black cabs. And I've often said to them, if you were a tribe in the Amazon, the UN would have sent out a special force to keep you, preserve and protect you. But in London, in the urban jungle, no one cares. I think, when you think about the genius of the West, the genius of Britain, the exceptionalism, I have no time for cultural relativism. No civilization has done more to improve the lot of the world than Western civilization. But the very qualities and attributes that made the West great come down to the fact that the Western mind, particularly, I would say, we can discuss it, the Western Protestant mind, was the driving force behind that change. The Westerners see the world differently to non-Westerners. Even our brains are different in terms of how we perceive the world, with visual reasoning, spatial awareness, attention spans. Westerners are very bad at facial recognition, for example, whereas non-Westerners use the right and the left hemisphere. We've co-opted the left hemisphere for language tasks, and so we're much worse at that. So we actually do view the world differently. We have different we have different concepts of guilt and shame. There are fundamental different ways in which Western exceptionalism is the reason for Western ascendancy, and if that Western uniqueness is diluted or disappears completely, the whole world loses.
How much of what you're talking about do you believe? And this is where the topic gets, uncomfortable, because we enter a space that has become such a taboo in mainstream media. How much of Western exceptionalism, in your opinion, is culture, and how much of it is to do with race?
And
the question is a trick question, Rafe, because obviously, as your surname suggests, you are Heydel, Polish, and Mankoo,
Sikh. Yeah. Well, so it's very easy to look to simplistic concepts of what is the reason behind this. We can discuss IQ and all that if you want to. But there's a professor called Joseph Heinrich at Harvard University who has written. He's a behavioral evolutionary psychologist, extremely respected individual, who wrote a book called "The Weirdest People in the World." And weird means
I'm familiar with it.
Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. The original weird countries were Western European countries. Now, of course, Japan, Singapore, South Korea have been brought into that as well. But he determines that the genius of the West, you can trace it back 1,000 years to a little-known decision of the Western Church, later to become the Catholic Church, to ban incest,
marriage,
and to ban cousin marriage within certain degrees of consanguinity. And it was at that point that you can see a divergence between the West and the rest of the world. So up to that point, but prior to 1,000 years ago, of course, Asia was the center of so much learning and development and inventions, and society was far more civilized in many respects than the England, Britain of the Dark Ages, for example. But 1,000 years ago, what happened was by banning cousin marriage, you ended the clans that still dominate in much of the world today, where your first, second, third, fourth, fifth cousin is treated as if they're brothers and sisters. And everything happens within those clans. They're corrupt, there's nepotism.
And for anyone who has traveled, and I have spent a large space of my life in Africa, and I've traveled across the continent from north to south, that is very true. It's very hard to explain this. We're sitting here, obviously, in London and talking about this, purely theoretically. When you've seen it, and I've been to places like Somaliland, I've been to the Democratic Republic of Congo, been to Malawi, these things, it's very real, and it's incredibly hard to explain. It's very difficult to convey how real that is.
90% of the world still has these cousin-based clanship systems. 90%. But you don't have to go that far. You just have to go to East London. You just have to go to East London to see the clans in action. And it's true, because cousin marriage is still alive and well in this country.
And one of the horrific ramifications of cousin marriage amongst the Pakistani community in the United Kingdom has been the horrific rise of children born with serious defects. I'm sure you'll correct me on the statistics, but I believe about 1/3 of all children born with serious congenital diseases are of Pakistani origin in the UK.
So Pakistani Muslims account for 3% of births and 33% of birth defects, so exactly 1/3, which of course is a burden on all taxpayers as well, because all taxpayers with our public healthcare system have to pay for all of this.
But sorry, Rafe, to go back to weird.
So with the death of these large extended clan systems and networks, you got the birth of the nuclear family, and that was a Western creation. Still to this day, 75% of the world doesn't have the nuclear family as we know it in the West today. And so suddenly you had to rely upon other people. You had to rely on strangers, and you got the birth of social trust. And high trust, social trust societies, nothing is more fundamental for economic prosperity and innovation than social trust. Social trust is the key indicator used by economists and social scientists and sociologists. And it is something which is more present in Western culture than in any other society. Can you trust your neighbor? Can you trust your fellow man? Can you depend upon them? Do you know, for example, if there's a water shortage, you can rely that they won't be using any water? It's that sort of level of trust. And because of the nuclear family being so small, they had to rely on other people. People began to then choose their own occupations, which led to the rise of contract law in the West. And through that, people began to congregate in new communities. So you had the birth of guilds, which were the earlier form of trade unions, of universities, of confraternities, of charter towns. Charter towns are towns that you sign a pledge to, I will join this town and help to build it and develop it. And suddenly you got in-group competition. The universities, the guilds, the charter towns, they were all competing with each other, and you got cross-pollination of ideas, and that's how innovation came. And suddenly you had this flourishing of intelligence and curiosity, which of course was the secret of the success of the Western mind. And then, of course, you had the birth of Protestantism. And what Protestantism did was it removed from the equation the priest. So suddenly you had the requirement for people to have their own relationship with God. It was all about personal responsibility, but also they had to become literate because they had to read the Bible for themselves. And so you had the spread of literacy. And individualism is a uniquely Western concept, which we've now exported elsewhere. And it is the Protestant countries. Firstly, it's an Anglosphere phenomenon. So the most individualistic nations in the world are America, Canada, Australia, Britain, New Zealand. But then it's the Scandinavian countries, which are obviously also. And so, for example, a great way psychologists can show this is by asking a Westerner and a non-Westerner to identify themselves. An individual would say, well, I'm Stefan, I'm a horse-riding extrovert who enjoys natty cravats. Whereas you would ask somebody from Africa, and they would say, well, I'm the father of X, I'm the son of so-and-so, and I'm the husband of Y. So for us, it's achievements and attributes that define who we are. In non-Western cultures, it's about who you are within the family system and within the clan. And you can even look at this on a granular level. So if you look at places like Italy, for example, the ban on cousin marriage applied very much to the north of Italy, but wasn't enforced so much in southern Italy. And of course, you can really see the distinction there in terms of the clan system, but also mafia, corruption.
Very much. That distinction is a fascinating one.
And it lives on today, for example, in so many different ways. So this idea, so we think of corruption being inherently bad, but if you're from a culture where it's all about looking after the clan and so forth, you don't really have those same sort of concepts. Same thing with crime. So when we commit a crime, or if we do something bad, we feel guilty because we have fallen short of our moral code. We haven't lived up to our own sense of honor. In other cultures, it's shame. Shame is a defining feature where I've let my family down, I've humiliated my family and so forth. Now, if you look, for example, they did a very interesting test in the United Nations in New York and looking at parking tickets, and they looked to see who was paying these parking tickets and who wasn't. Now, when you're UN diplomats, you come from the elite of every culture and every society, so that's a very good measure because we're talking about the creme de la creme from all parts of the world, and unsurprisingly, Westerners were paying these, and non-Westerners weren't paying these. And so I think it's a very good thesis that he's put forward. And this also comes down. You can really sense the distinction between the Western mind and the non-Western mind through things like our interest in our curiosity. Why didn't the Chinese discover the Americas? Why didn't they sail around the world? Why was it Westerners who were the first people to circumnavigate the globe, for example? The Chinese fleet was hugely impressive. Their ships were much larger than European ships and much more, but they had no interest, no curiosity to explore the world. So, for example, this I always find this fascinating. The three longest rivers in the world, the Nile, the Amazon, and the Yangtze. The first person to walk the length of the Amazon was an Englishman in 2010. First person to walk the length of the Nile was an Englishman in 2015. First person to walk the length of the Yangtze in China was a Welshman in 2019. Now, China's a 5,000 whatever year old civilization. Nobody had the curiosity or the interest to do that. That's a Western. First person, of course, to climb Everest was Edmund Hillary of English stock and descent. First person to walk around the world was an American. First one to run was a British person. The North and South Poles were Brits, Americans, and Norwegians. That really, I think, in a nutshell, demonstrates the completely different way in which Westerners perceive the world and see the world as a challenge and something to pursue. And that, of course, explains why the West was ascendant. And of course, everyone has benefited because of our advances in science, technology, engineering, medicine, democracy, the rule of law, the birth of individualism. No culture has done more to improve the lot of life of the entire globe. And I think for far too long now, we have been too nihilistic, we have been navel-gazing, wearing horsehair shirts and self-flagellating about perceived wrongs committed during the age of empire and slavery. When any culture, any civilization, any nation is most flourishing, most thriving, it's when it's self-assured, it shows strength, and it's self-confident. And it's no surprise that we are lacking those three things just at the time when we are at our most fragile.
This individualism, it reminds me of a very interesting documentary I saw called The Swedish Theory of Love. It was made about a decade ago by Swedish leftists, and it was based on, amongst others, a theory by a Polish Jewish philosopher called Zygmunt Bauman, who formulated this idea that there could be no true love if there was a dependency, which meant that you had to make that a bond between a mother and child, the child was dependent on the parent, so it couldn't be true love. And the general thesis of the film, it covered a number of subjects. A lonely woman trying to find, and she ends up getting a sperm donor to be able to get to become pregnant. And it covered also a company that was dealing with people who died in Sweden, and no one had bothered to pick up their bodies because no one knew they were dead because they had no children, no spouse, and they'd been rotting in their flats for weeks. And it was this sort of, it was very interesting because it was a snapshot into perhaps one of the most individualistic societies on planet Earth, Sweden. And it showed you these snapshots of people looking for some form of love in this absolutely bizarre world. I mean, there was like a sort of community of forest-going people who would just hug each other in this forest in some bizarre search of companionship in this incredible, overly done, essentially individualism, stripped of religion, stripped of any real sense of community. And the one of the takeaways of the film that I had when I watched it was that in their pursuit to free everyone of dependency, what they had actually done is they'd made everyone dependent on the state. So instead of your parents providing for you, the state came in and said, no, we will provide instead of your own parents. Anyway, sort of reminded me of that. Let's go back to one of the points that you made, and let's talk about assimilation. Now, I bring this up partially because you are obviously a case of an assimilated descendant of Poles, descendants of Sikhs. You're obviously British by every, perhaps except the ethnic metric.
Yeah.
Does it matter? I mean, aren't you proof that it doesn't matter?
No.
Aren't you evidence that you can come from a Pole, a Sikh, and become British?
Everything it's like curry powder, right? A little bit's fine. Too much is overpowering, I think, right? So, as I said earlier on, this is not an attack on immigration. This is an attack on mass immigration. We're talking about the whole scale, fundamental change, dare I say, replacement of a population. I think where we were in the 1980s was a perfectly decent place to be in. We had got to a point where the nation was almost colorblind. So your viewers may not be familiar with these sports stars, but we had people like black athletes like Linford Christie, Daley Thompson, so we had black comedians like Kenny Lynch. Nobody ever thought of them as being anything other than British. That just didn't come into the mind. They were perfectly well assimilated. I mean, it's also the type of immigrants you get, and something that people often don't realize is one of the reasons why lots of black people integrated very well into British society in that era was because, of course, unlike people coming from India or from the Islamic world, they had lost their languages. They didn't have any religion other than Christianity, and so they didn't have any competing ideology in terms of assimilating into British society. That's why you had such success in the 1980s, I would say, with certain types of black immigrants being becoming essentially just proper Cockneys in London and so forth. But that level of immigration was tiny.
So what numbers are we talking about? Give me a number.
Well, Britain was 80-something% white British just in the beginning of this century. It was 90% when I was a child, white British. So there's nothing wrong with having a certain amount of migrants in the community. The question is, firstly, how many are coming in? What impact are they having? Do you have the right type of immigrants coming into the country? Are they contributing in a positive way? And I would say nobody would say someone like Suella Braverman, for example, or Kwasi Kwarteng are in anything other than British. But it's been the elevation of minority cultures over British culture. It has been the arrival of millions of people within a very short period of time. I mean, of all the foreign-born people living in this country, 10 million or more, half of them arrived within the last 10 years. And assimilation is impossible when you have those numbers, especially when they're coming from completely incompatible cultures. And so, of course, you have the rise of ghettos now, and there is no incentive to integrate when people are living their lives without having any interaction with wider society. They live in these ghettos. We know, for example, that Muslims are twice as likely to become extremists if they live in these ghettos. They have their own shops, their own places of worship. They watch their own television programs. They have no interaction. There are parts of the north of England where school children think Britain is majority Asian because that's all that they see in their daily lives around them. And often these ghettos, of course, become these segregated communities become the hotbed for terribly abhorrent cultural practices. We discussed the rape gangs. Britain is now the global centre for acid attacks. We've talked about cousin marriage, this child marriage, forced marriages, female genital mutilation. Sure. Quite remarkably, the Metropolitan Police in London now have a department training police in how to detect child abuse linked to witchcraft rituals from black Africans who've come here and still practice. We still have human sacrifice, remember, in places like Uganda and elsewhere. Human sacrifice continues. We've had examples in this country of limbless bodies being found in the Thames and so forth. So,
wow. Wasn't aware of that. That's insane. One
of the reasons I first fell in love with history as a child was because I loved hearing about the Tudors, right, and beheadings and witchcrafts. And that was long ago. I didn't realize they'll be back on the streets of 21st century Britain. That's what
And you're still just as fascinated by it, Rafe.
But that's what we've imported into this country, and so you do have to have questions about that, all of that. I think it's deeply damaging. Nobody's willing to have those sorts of conversations, and this is legal immigration again. As I said, this is not illegal immigration.
Rafe, what I suggest we do is we will do a part 2 in which we discuss the solutions to all of these problems that we've highlighted. It's been absolutely horrific to listen to you speak. Just appalling. I mean,
yes, that was a downer.
I'm laughing, but I have to tell you, there's nothing particularly funny about what you've said. It's all been incredibly depressing.
I think it's black humor, isn't it?
Thank you very much, Rafe. Much appreciated.